Jamila Minnicks' novel Moonrise over New Jessup won the 2021 Penn Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction. In 2022, she was awarded a Tennessee Williams Scholarship for the Sewanee Writers Conference, and she also earned a residency at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. Her short fiction and essays have been published in Craft, Catapult, Blackbird, The Right Launch, and elsewhere. Her piece, Politics of Distraction, was nominated for the Pushcart Prize. Minnicks is a graduate of the University of Michigan, the Howard University School of Law, and the Georgetown University Law Center. She lives in Washington, D.C. And here with us is Jade Brockington. Jade Brockington is a freshman at Francis Marion University. Jade is majoring in psychology. She is originally from Hartsville, South Carolina, and plans to become a therapist after graduating. Jade is going to be moderating this colloquium, so let's give it up for them. And Jade, before we get started, I'll read a short summary of Moonrise over New Jessup. And you can read more at jamilaminnicks.com. It's 1957, and after leaving the only home she's ever known, Alice Young steps off the bus into all-black New Jessup, Alabama, where residents have largely rejected integration as the means for black social advancement. Instead, they seek to maintain and fortify the community they cherish on their side of the woods. In this place, Alice falls in love with Raymond Campbell, whose clandestine organizing activities challenge New Jessup's long-standing status quo and could lead to the young couple's expulsion, or worse, from the home they both hold dear. But as Raymond continues to push alternatives for enhancing New Jessup's political power, Alice must find a way to balance her undying support for his underground work with her desire to protect New Jessup from the rising pressure of upheaval from inside and outside their side of town. Okay, Jade? Whenever you're ready.
All right. Hello, Ms. Minnicks.
Hello.
Thank you for coming down to Francis Marion.
Of course. Thank you all for having me.
So, your book. I'm hoping most of us have already read it, but...
Show of hands. Everybody read it?
Okay. Good.
Great. All right. So we can have spoilers.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right.
So, I got this book assigned for me for my English class. Thank you. Such a good read. And while I was reading through it, me and my classmates, we ended up with a few questions about the story and like the writing process and all that stuff. So everyone finds inspiration in a bunch of different places. Where did you find the inspiration to start writing the novel?
I found the inspiration for the novel from the stories from my family. You know, I came up in this family of incredible storytellers, as I'm sure a lot of you have a couple of people in your family who have told you about your history. And as I have gotten a little bit older and had the opportunity to really hear from them more and sort of marinate on the things that they told me when I was your age and a little bit older, it just sort of came to me. I wanted to hear more about Alice's story, because Alice was sort of the quiet one. I envisioned her as being somebody who's sort of the quiet one and the one who, over the course of history, we don't get to hear from, after all, after generations go by, and she's the one you're looking at old pictures, and somebody says, oh, I know her name. And she'll be holding a turkey or something in this photo of like a Thanksgiving dinner. And people will remember the person sitting down. They'll remember Percy because he's a loudmouth. They'll remember Raymond was about to punch Percy in the face. They'll remember all these different things about the dynamic of the dinner. But over the course of time, they'll even remember that that turkey was dry. But they will forget Alice's name. And so I wanted to tell that story from her perspective.
All right, so the characters, of course, they are a super big focus in the story. Mm-hmm. We see like everything about them, like Alice and Raymond's moments, good and bad. Alice creates a lot of sisterly bonds with a lot of the female characters, and there's a lot of like found family elements in the story. The interactions between them are so like natural, and I was just wondering how you got these ideas and really fleshed them out to bring them to life on paper, and like, did you take any inspiration like explicitly from people in your life?
Oh yeah, Alice is all the women in my family. So my mama had 4 sisters, and the last of them passed away this year. But when my family was reading the book, my Aunt Clara, who was my mama's second oldest sister, she said, is this based on, do we have an Alice Young in our family? Because my mama's maiden name is Young. And I said, well, no, ma'am, I mean, not that I know of. And she just sort of looked at me matter-of-factly, and she said, we have an Alice in our family. No, she didn't know anybody named Alice, but she's telling me that Alice is her and my mama and all of her aunts and cousins and stuff. So Alice is definitely inspired by those women, and then everybody in the story carries the name of somebody in my family. They all have different traits from different people. Pop and Mr. Marvin definitely have traits of my Uncle John, you know. Everybody in my family that I was very close to in some way, shape, or form is represented in the book. And I think it's important when we're talking about a book, particularly about my community, my family, my ancestors and elders, that I stay true to who they were. But they also, you know, each one of us has a story and it's so rich and diverse that it just makes for a really, to me, a compelling story because each of them had something to say.
Of course. The setting is also super important as it regards into like the Black community and all this stuff. It adds on to the characters' hardships, gives us like major plot points, like the landlord that Alice had, the NNAS as a whole. I was wondering why you picked this specific time when planning on how to tell the story, and what sort of research did you do to make sure it was super accurate?
So a lot of the research, again, was back to my family stories, but you have to keep in mind this is 1957 when this narrative starts. The late 50s, mid to late 50s and 60s really in the South was a time of real upheaval because of Brown versus the Board of Education, but really the narrative has been crafted around the resistance to integration of the schools by the white community. And so over time that the narrative has sort of become whiteness, and the proximity to whiteness was what we were fighting for because that's what was supposed to save our community. But these communities have been, there are 1,200 Black towns or settlements in the United States. The first ones were founded in the late 1700s. So these were always communities where Black people lived together in our own imperfections, but we certainly lived together and found community together. And a lot of the ways that we lived together carried the culture that we have inside of us internally as African Americans. And so a lot of the things you see in these communities where you'll have a family and they'll all live on the same land and they'll call it a family compound, that's African. You know, there were certain things that we were doing in these communities that we wouldn't have even recognized as being something ancestral, but we were very much carrying on traditions of community care, of community development with regard to building churches, schools, businesses. These were things that these communities did, and so it was important to pay proper honor to the communities as they existed instead of sort of, you know, just making something up whole cloth, because quite frankly, my imagination, I think, is pretty good, but these communities had a lot to work with. So it was just a matter of really getting into, okay, well, what did it look like? And my family grew up in the Jim Crow South. You know, my family's from Alabama. Is anybody from Alabama in here? All, yeah? All right, so nobody else? This is all South Carolina in here? Anybody from outside South Carolina? Where from? All right. Virginia? Okay, all right. But so the other thing that was really important to me is, you know, we talked about this at lunch, and I'll say this all day, every day, because this is how I was raised. When you talk about Alabama, you talk about the Deep South, it grinds my gears, something terrible for people to put all the sins in America on the South. Because my family has been in Alabama, the Young family has been in Alabama since I can trace back to 1813. And so we were in the proximity, in the territory before Alabama was even a state. So as we say when I go home, what you ain't finna do is come to me talking about how terrible the South is, particularly for Black people, because for me, for my family, it was always the setting, you know, getting back to the setting, it was about this place being a place where we can have love, we can have land, we can have all these things, this community that we're looking for, but you have to recognize that the sin is not in that soil where we're living. It's in the hearts of man that are trying to manipulate people. So the setting plays a really crucial role in the whole story because we loved it there. We love it there to this day.
All right. There's a lot of controversial subjects in the novel, mainly like race, gender. There's a lot of like family dynamic stuff. Were there any particular issues that were like easier or way harder to talk about or write about than others?
No. No, because, I mean, one thing I hope people take away from this book is that it's honest. It may make you uncomfortable. And when I had somebody tell me that the book was controversial once, but I always question what it is about a black community doing its own thing feels controversial. Because you have to consider that lens, right? Like to people just minding their business, going to church on Sunday and, fighting over the same man. That's the controversy, right? Like you all are fussing over this man. It's not like we're living in this space and like this big, the world outside. Like you have to recognize that this, even today, and we're all feeling sort of this kind of way about the election, good, bad, whatever. But we're in this community together today in this space, living life. And I think it's important for us to understand that we don't live in a, quote, era. We live life as it comes to us. And so to say that the book is controversial, I think is to look at it in the lens of sort of, we're reading a book that's not our time. But I want us to think about things from the inside out instead of from the outside in. And then if you think about it, some of the stuff like disagreements about integration, okay, it's like your uncle says something weird at the family reunion. That's life too though, right? Like if he starts talking crazy, it's like, okay, whatever. But I want us to think about how we're inhabiting space in a time that feels like a lot of people are just giving up hope in one way or another, but there's life to be lived and to fight for. And so that, when you say controversial, I'm like, no, it doesn't feel controversial to me. It just feels true. It feels like life.
Right. Okay, so we're going to move on to the writing process itself. How did you plan the story out? Like, I've heard all sorts of stories, like you write little blobs of it, like sporadically and try and put it together, or you have it in order before you start writing. Were there any parts of the book that were like harder to write than others, or like how did you get around that?
Yeah, I mean, I started this book in June of 2020. And it was really, I didn't have an outline or anything like that. I just wrote it because it was something on my heart. And I finished the first draft in like 3 months. It was just something that I just felt I wanted to write. So I sat down every morning before work and I wrote, and after work I wrote. And, where I found that being difficult was when I was trying to navigate for the people in the story. Because you'll notice I don't call the people characters in my work, I call them people. I think it's a lot harder to traumatize, to do things to people in your work, but when you have characters, people talk about how does this character serve the story? And I think that when we're writing about people, it's a lot harder to ask yourself, well, should I just kill this person because it's like moves the plot forward? That feels very different to me. And people may agree, disagree. But the hardest part was when I would write something and I felt like, okay, this would be a really great direction for the story to go, and I would hit a roadblock. And it was because really it felt like throughout this narrative, Alice is telling me her story. And so there becomes a point when I replace her voice for mine, and I just envision her being like my auntie who's telling me a story, telling a kid a story, and then the kid is regurgitating it, and the auntie just sitting back, well, you know it better than I do, so why don't you go on? And so it's like, I mean, y'all don't know that auntie. I definitely have that auntie who would just sit back and not say anything else, because to her, it's like, you have taken over the narrative. So let me just go on and shut up because this is your story now. So that very much felt like how Alice was sort of telling me the story. And so when I would cut back 10, 20,000 words, which is painful, and I cut it and move it to another document because I'm not a masochist, but I would, I would cut it and put it in another document, and then it felt like I was getting back to the fork in the road. And now it was Alice saying, okay, you know, you've said your piece, now we're going to go down this way. And so that was hard because, you know, it's your story that you're writing, but it's your narrative that you're writing, but it's not your story. So I think it was important to listen to that voice.
All right. Okay. So I feel like most people have questions about the ending of the book. There's a lot of unanswered questions. Alice's health is kind of all over the place. They were talking about whether to stay in New Jessup at all, and then the Rosie situation. Why did you choose to leave the ending so open for interpretation?
Because I want y'all to use your imaginations. I mean, not just in the sense of what happens in New Jessup, and with Rosie, although that's certainly. But one thing that I find so much that's going on right now is our imaginations for what's possible is getting so crushed. And when you have the opportunity to experience an open ending, I think it opens your mind to all sorts of possibilities, not just for what's going on in New Jessup, but what could be for a community like this, or what you want to see for your community. So, and the open ending with Rosie, that sort of stuff happened. I mean, the Great Migration was a real thing. 6 million people left 6 million black people left the southern United States between 1915, thereabouts, until about the 70s. Just left their home, left land, right here in South Carolina. This pipeline went right to New York City. So it's important for people to understand that, and also to understand that when people got north, you know, there's this narrative that the Great Migration, people are going to great things. Instead of the magnitude, 6 million people moving, people now look at the Great Migration and they say, oh, you were just going to something greater. I'll tell you, the greatest place I live and the greatest place where I love is Alabama. But my family and people from my family left because they had to. So that wasn't necessarily a great thing. It wasn't great that they left their land behind. So with Rosie, I also want y'all to think about what it means to not have a phone in your pocket or in your house. And the only way that you can get in contact with somebody is a letter. And the only phone that's available is probably at the county store or something that's like a couple miles up the road. You know, it's easy to lose those connections. And I'll tell you, when my family read the book, they said, how did you know about your uncle? I said, what uncle? My cousin said, exactly, because we have an uncle who we lost and nobody ever heard from again. Some of y'all could be my cousins for all I know. You know? And it's funny, but think about how tragic that is, that so many of us know that story. You know what I'm saying? So that's why with Rosie, you know, it felt like a real disservice to the people in my community to have a nice, neat ending when so many of us have not had that. So that's why you all experience that.
All right. Audience questions?
Yes, so Raymond and Alice got married in the book. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then so about halfway through the book, they got married, and then she became Alice Campbell. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Alice was sick,
Mm-hmm.
and her own life, she had a baby. Is the baby a boy or girl?
Oh, B is the little girl.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
The broken story is written by you?
Yes.
Next little question.
Yeah, thank you for your question. All right, y'all, don't be shy, because there's like a whole list, a bunch of note cards up here, so I know y'all have questions. I'm sorry? So I'm working on another book now. It is not the sequel to New Jessup. There is another book after that book. Now, the book I'm working on now, if you like New Jessup, you will like this book. But the book after this current book is Rosie's story. I need y'all to be that excited about the book I'm working on now. I'm a little offended. I mean, with Beatty, you get a little bit of magic, you get a little bit of, you get some labor organizing, you get a whole crime family. I mean, come on now. Can I get a little love for the, Gulf Coast, Alabama? Can I get a little love for that? Come on now. I mean, yeah, you get Rosie. It's okay. It'll be all right.
Any other questions?
Just for the people in the back, I guess. The open-ended ending, we still have the threat of the white town on the other side of the woods. What are you hoping, or hoping for us to kind of, because when it ended, I still had that looming, oh God, it's just beginning kind of thought. And I was wondering, was that an intent, or is that just me reading into that and saying, okay, this was just volley number one, and there is real threat to this town from the other side of the woods, or, because that is a very real threat to Black communities, is white encroachment, especially when they feel that the Black community shouldn't exist there.
That's actually a really interesting and really good question, because I think with Jessup, with any of these sort of sundown towns, I mean, y'all are familiar with sundown towns? So there's this idea that in the sundown towns, Black people need to be out of town by sundown and don't come back before sunrise, right? So but in between can't see, as they say, you need Black people to work in the mills, in the houses, all these other things, right? But what's so interesting is what happens in a community like Jessup is that once you don't have Black people to abuse, that's why she gets into the whole thing about Chase has to prove to people that he's nobody's Negro. Because at a certain level, then it's like, well, who's going to be sort of the lowest on the food chain now in that particular town? All the Black people over here. So, I mean, to the question about sort of white retribution and all this stuff, these towns, they existed in these spaces because of the need for our labor. I mean, make no mistake about that. There's no, it's not like a Pollyanna sort of, it's the labor and also to a certain extent sort of the trade, the dollars, right? And the tax dollars that were going into the base. But I think it's interesting when, at the end of the book, that overarching threat of white supremacy is ever present. You know what I'm saying? And so it was a conscious decision to tell this story from inside of New Jessup. I actually had somebody ask me, she said, it was during my tour, and she said, I can't give this book to my friend because her friend's daughter had had cardiac issues and passed away. And I said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. Obviously, we want to protect her. And she said, but why did you make it so that there was racism and Alice had a heart problem? I said, because Black people don't get a day off from racism. Right, so we don't get a day to have a heart problem and a day to deal with anti-Blackness. That's our everyday experience. And so I think it's important when we look at these towns to understand, I hope by saying that, folks understand what exactly it meant for us to build it in the first place. I've had a lot of young Black people say, well, then what's the point, right? And that's the point, right? That's one of the very deep and enduring functions of white supremacy is to make us feel hopeless, What's the point of building a community like this if they're just going to take it away? And I think that that's a real danger to this imagination that I've been talking about, why we have open endings. Because I need y'all to have a bigger imagination than what somebody else allows you to have. And that's for all of us, but I'm specifically speaking to my students of color, because I think it's really dangerous in this country right now for a lot of us, particularly when we adopt these feelings about ourselves that we know are untrue. And we make ourselves small to fit in boxes where we should be breaking out of. Or we sit at tables we should be flipping, for my Christians in here, you know what I'm saying? So I just think that it's, when we think about the open-ended nature of the book, I hope that you all can see the community and how special it is. So then that way, if your mind does go to, you know, Greenwood or Rosewood or Wilmington or these places of racialized violence, that you understand what was special about these places and it makes you want to see them, see safe spaces like them exist.
All right, we had a question back there.
Thank you. Great. The open ending I kind of push against. Like, I do feel like there's the ellipsis, like some of it is like a ... ellipsis, that like the political future, but it does feel like you put a period on the most important thing, which is like the love and the community.
I thought I did, but everybody's telling me I didn't, so I guess
Yeah. So anyways, I just want to say, because that is the key to then to the future, is once that's established. And that list you just gave of those towns, you know, those in some ways are like models for like Negro Jessup, right? The town, the former town that was kind of destroyed by...
Yeah, so Greenwood actually is a model for Negro Jessup, right? Because what people don't understand was Greenwood was built between 1905 and 1921. So in 16 years they built Greenwood. And so when people come to me and they talk about Greenwood being destroyed, and there's sort of this feeling of like, oh, Greenwood. I'm like, what are you lamenting? Right? Like, what do you know about Greenwood to be sad about, other than the fact that you know it was a black settlement? Do you know what was there? And the thing that I always think about is how little people actually know about what was built the first time. You know, Greenwood had hotels, hospitals, savings. It had all the things that you had in New Jessup. In 1905, Oklahoma, where they started to build, right? And so to think about the resources that they had available, the land that they were building on, to build all of those things. They even had photography studios. Do you know how, like, we have folks, like, cameras in our phones? A photography studio in Greenwood, Oklahoma, in like 1910? That's unheard of. And so when people come and they show me these photos of the devastation, my first question to people who do that is, what was that building? Who is that man standing over that building? Was it a church? Was it one of the photography studios? Was it a hotel? Who were the people who came through the hotel? Who were the people who worshiped in the church? If you can't tell me how people lived, don't come to me telling me how they died, because now all you're doing is capitalizing on somebody's trauma. And I think it's really irresponsible for writers to just take trauma from my community to make money off of it, right? And it's like all you're feeding people is this trauma narrative, but you're not telling people how empowered they were. And then to leave out the part about Greenwood rebuilding. How many of y'all knew that Greenwood rebuilt? Anybody? So Greenwood really fell apart because of population loss. The riots certainly didn't help, but you know, the riots were an interruption to the building in Greenwood. The highway was an interruption to Greenwood. All these other interruptions happened, but Greenwood built. And so I think it's important when we're talking about this literature, any literature, I think we should demand of our stories a full story. I write Black empowerment literature, in case y'all didn't know. I write stories to empower Black people. I welcome everybody to read the work, but I want Black people to see what we have done. And that's not the same regurgitated trauma narrative that we continue to get over and over and over again. Thanks.
All right. Any more questions? Over there.
Okay. Well, first off, I want to say you're very beautiful.
Oh, thank
Like,
you.
That's the first thing. What advice would you have for anyone that wants to write their book? Because I'm thinking about writing my book, but I don't know like where to start.
Two things. I think Joangela gave a great answer earlier. The first thing I think makes a really excellent writer is a reader. So I would say you pick out like writers that speak to you. I mean, for me, it's like Morrison, Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, Alice Walker. So there's this really great tradition of fiction writers and then current sort of nonfiction writers. But also when it comes to telling your story, tell the stories that speak most to you. You know, like I said with Alice, being the auntie who sort of like sits back and is like, you know this better than I do, apparently. You know, allow your stories to be organic and sort of figure out what the good time of day is. Like Morrison used to write during what she called the snatches of the day. I write at 4 a.m. And so that's the time of day when, you know, I have a dream sequence. It's probably because I just dreamed it, right? So find the times that work best for you and jealously guard your time, your writing time. Put your phones down. That, I'm telling you guys, and I'm guilty of this too, particularly if I just posted something and I want to see if I'm getting likes and stuff. Put your phone in another room because it is the thief of your creativity. It really, really is. If you're trying to write a book, your book deserves your entire dedication because it's not just getting the first draft out, it's the revision and the revision and the revision and the revision and really getting to know the story. So, but you got to make a writing practice. If it's not every day, it's every weekday, or, you know, pick a time and days and get to work.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, back there.
So I know you mentioned thank you, stories from like your family influencing you, but are there any authors or like any piece of literature that inspired some of your work or what you wrote about?
Oh, yeah. I read the entire Toni Morrison canon once a year. And it's in some sort of chaotic order. I mean, I think some years I read like Sula probably twice. So Morrison obviously is a really big influence in my work, as is Hurston. I mentioned Baldwin. There's a writer right now, Robert Jones Jr. He used to be the son of Baldwin. He's really doing some exciting work. Y'all had Disha Filial last year. She's a really good friend of mine. Secret Lives of Church Ladies. It's a really dope book. And as far as nonfiction, you cannot go wrong with like Imani Perry or anything by Eddie Glaude Jr. I mean, these are people, for the work that I'm doing, that really give voice to sort of the fullness of Blackness and also the fullness of the struggle that we've experienced, but also the beautiful joy. And so Imani's book, South to America, I talked about a little bit earlier, is a book I would highly recommend. Eddie's book, We Are the Heroes We're Waiting For, is another one that I recommend for everybody who's sort of feeling some kind of way right now. It's really about activism and getting into a particular, finding your space in the activist space. And it relies heavily on Baldwin. So, you know, those are some of my personal favorites. I mean, I have poets, Nate Marshall. I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with his work. He's a poet out of Chicago. His latest collection is called Finna. In case you're wondering if it's Black enough, it's called Finna. So he does some really exciting work. So those are sort of the people that influenced New Jessup, and I'm reading I've read a lot of nonfiction lately for my newest piece, but you know, that's all Gulf Coast, Alabama fictions, or research and stuff. So hopefully that helps. I have a laundry list. I should have a list because I get this question a lot, but it doesn't really change.
All right, any more?
Hello.
Hello.
So I want to go back to the characters. What made you decide on Patience's personality? Because she was a lot.
She is a lot, right?
Yeah, she was a lot.
Yeah, well, you have to think about Patience. It's always been Patience and the fellas, right? Since she was this big. And so Patience, and remember Mrs. Washington said, I've never known her to have a girlfriend, right? She's always been around the brothers, even when she was a little girl. And so I think there was a lot of sexism inside the civil rights movement. You know, a lot of the women like Ella Baker, all these women who were really fighting for a seat at the table and who are now largely credited with having great ideas. But at the time, there was a lot of rampant sexism. And so Patience, who had known these brothers since she was knee-high, right? She's trying to have her seat at the table for the future of New Jessup, and she's being pushed back against at every turn. So then, here comes Alice, this little pretty princess from around the way, right? Who's supposed to be Patience's ally in her mind. And I think, Patience, I think she's complicated because everybody in the story wants New Jessup to have more than it has, right? Or to stay viable. But those two have such wildly different ideas of what that looks like, the road to get there looks like. And then Patience is also getting from the other brothers, Hugo saying, now we got Alice, maybe Patience will settle down and be like our wives. Now, can you imagine? These are your friends, your brothers, your cousins, and some new girl comes into the mix, and she ends up being like the other girls that you can't stand anyway. I think that there are dynamics at play that have to do with like male-female friendships that she came up with. I think the dynamics of the civil rights movement came into play. And that would have seeped over into Raymond's conversations with Matthew. He says, you need to get your woman in line, right? So I think that at the end of the day, Patience is really pushing back against that and trying for all of the women to have a seat at the table. And so I know, you gotta keep in mind, this is a story told by Alice. She's not gonna paint Patience. If this is Patience's book, this is a very different book, right? Because Patience isn't gonna have much nice to say about Alice, right? So, I think you have to think about perspective. You gotta think about what she's pushing against. And y'all give Patience some grace. She's not she's not the devil. All of us got a little Patience in us, and all of us got a little Alice in us, and all of us probably got a little Raymond in us, and all of us probably got a little Matthew in us. So give Patience a little grace.
All right, anyone else?
Why do I feel like this is not a graceful question about Patience?
No, it's not. I have two questions, actually. Have you ever stopped in the middle of a page writing and you have such bad writer's block that you just walk off and just I don't want to do this no more? Have you ever had that much blockage, or have you ever trashed an entire page and did it better the second time?
Oh, yeah. I like I said, when Alice would stop speak, I would write beautiful prose. I'd be like, yeah, I'm on fire. I'm cooking here, right? But then the book itself, the story itself, would just get to a do not enter zone. None shall pass. There's no other next word. That's it. And I had to be honest with myself who I was writing for and what I was writing about. And I'm writing to impress myself, right? And so that's why, I always envisioned just a little kid making up some story. And then the auntie is like, okay. And so then you have to pull back, and that's why I say 20, 30,000 words. At one point I pulled back, I cut 40,000 words from this novel. And I said, because I gave myself permission early on, if I felt like I had gotten to that do not enter place, to not be precious about my words, because it's me. And the one thing we owe the people in our stories is the right to tell their own story. We got to learn how to get out of the way. And so I think when you look at it when I started really looking at it as, I'm just a medium to bring these stories into the world. Sometimes, I get writer's block, and I'll get up and take a walk. I'll tell you, I am, between the hours of 4 a.m. and 2 p.m., I am brilliant. But if I get to that 7, 8 o'clock hour, I refuse to tinker even with a comma because I know I'm tired. I'm looking at this through a different lens. And when I come back to it again in the morning, I'm like, yeah, I was brilliant. You know what I'm saying? So you have to give yourself the grace to understand when you're tired, when you're hungry, when somebody's made you mad. And it's, there are different forces outside of you that are just impacting your writing. But you also have to get out of the way and not be precious about the beauty of your own language to the disservice of the story.
With Raymond, this is my second question. With Raymond, it's like he's playing both sides. Because in some pages, he's very toxic. Like, he's just talking to his brother about how no woman part in the world will make him stay where he is. And I just think that was very toxic of him to say that.
Oh,
Like,
that was Percy that said that.
Oh, Percy. Why would you say that, though?
You asked me why a man would say something like that?
Like, was that just part of his time in that frame? Was that just part of their time back then?
Oh, so men don't do that anymore, is what you're saying.
I'm asking.
I mean, I think, but that's real talk, though, right? Like when you two brothers, and keep in mind, Percy went to Alabama State because of Raymond. Percy got involved in the Montgomery boycott because of Raymond. Percy got into all this stuff and decided to live in Montgomery because of who?
Raymond.
Okay, and now your brother, who has been having the time of his life in Montgomery, who has said to you, Percy, I'm never going back to New Jessup. There's nothing, there's backwards Negroes back there ain't got nothing for me. And then your brother is literally supposed to be on the road right behind you coming back from your mama's funeral. And then a year passes, and he still hasn't come back to Montgomery, and you come back, and his girl, not only are they engaged, she comes out the house in your deceased mama's apron. Come on. I mean, Percy was actually a lot of fun to write because Percy is like my cousins, right? Like he's men I know, right? Like it or not, my cousins are good men, but they have toxic traits. And so, yeah, he would absolutely say that. They would absolutely tussle a little bit back in the day, But you have to think about all of the ways that, they're stair steps. They're hardly a year apart. And his brother, now he's abandoned Percy and Dot in Montgomery because his nose is wide open. So Percy's going to have something to say about it because he's Percy. And they've, even Dot, they're like, this is his personality, right? They know that man. We all know that man. We all know a Percy who just talks too much and he's just asking somebody to whoop his behind. We all know him, and that is him.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, anyone else? Oh.
Was there someone else?
I noticed him first. I'm so sorry.
Oh, I know that you said about writing a book of Rosie. Have you ever thought about writing books about other characters' personalities? Like, because I think Percy would have a great story to tell over in Montgomery, and even Patience would have a great story.
Yeah, and I've had actually people ask me about whether I would write New Jessup from Raymond's perspective. And to me, this is like a full universe, right? And so everybody sort of gets their say. But it's interesting, Percy, nobody has ever responded and asked if I would do a Percy novel. He would be, I mean, it's a great idea. I like the idea. I have not given much thought to it, but now that you say that, it just, I mean, that brother he probably had more words to say than they would give me a word count in a novel. But yeah, I mean, I think that would be a really compelling story. I think seeing his viewpoint in Montgomery, because you do get a little bit of their story in Montgomery through Raymond. But, I think the relationship between him and Dot is very compelling. The work that they did in Montgomery, building up the cars, that neighborhood in Montgomery was where they lived, that's mentioned in the book, is a real neighborhood that was paved over by a highway. So that happened maybe 2 or 3 years after the book ended, where the highway came through. And so I think they would be devastated to know that their sister's house had been displaced. and that, you know, the church that they were going to is no longer there. And that, so I do think that other people in the book would definitely make for some good stories. That's a good idea, thanks. I mean, particularly Percy, you got me thinking. Thanks for that.
All right.
I also have another question about one of the people in your book, Raymond's dad. And I hope this isn't my memory failing me, but I'm not sure it was clear after Raymond disclosed the whole NNAS plan to his father, what exactly his dad, Pop, was going to do going forward with that. Because I think it ended on him just saying, like, I guess just the equivalent of like throwing his hands up and walking away. But I think he did say that he was going to like keep it a secret by not telling Cap. So I was just wondering, going forward with him, where you think he was going to go with that information.
Well, you know, you have to keep in mind, Pop, Cap, and Mr. Marvin were sort of the three representatives that the White Citizens Council chose. And so y'all are familiar with White Citizens Councils and the role they played in sort of the Jim Crow. So they were councils that popped up all over the South in response to Brown versus the Board of Education, where you had concerned white citizens, and they were like chock full of like people in white supremacist organizations who were trying to find ways to fight against implementing Brown versus the Board of Education in their particular locales. And so what they would do is, in places that had like a new Jessup, they would find sort of the ambassadors, if you will, from New Jessup and the other places, and to say, you know, what all is going on over there. That's why Cap is a deputy, right? He's not a captain of anything, but the black people call him Cap because he's our captain, and he's got other deputies that work underneath him. So what their role is a role that's historically accurate. They would go to these meetings and say, there's nothing to see over here, right? And I think that's important to recognize then the duality of the role of the lives that they're living, because then when they figure out what's going on with patients, they don't take that to the council. They have to handle that in-house. And so for Pop to know that his son is involved in this, you know, that it's more than a betrayal, it's a danger. And I think he probably, more than a lot of other people in New Jessup who are not privy to these meetings, understands the real danger. I think I think that a lot of times we explode or we discipline out of fear for our children. And so I think that explosion and the whole, I have to keep this secret, it wasn't just the idea that I can't, like I'm disappointed. He understands the real ramifications for his son, his family, his community, if any of this is to get out. But he also understands, the people in the community already know that they are doing, like there's sort of talk about municipality status. So this thing already has legs. And so you have to sort of figure out, you can't stop that. You don't want to stop that. But you also, when you figure out that now a national civil rights organization is associated with this, that's a major no-no at the time. Because at the time, the NAACP had been outlawed in Alabama. They were subject to arrest just for being part of an organization like that. So I think an arrest is not, you know, going to jail and sort of sitting there and writing a letter from the Birmingham jail. I mean, there's real consequences that go along with that. And so I think for him, you know, holding that secret, holding that close is a major act that speaks volumes in and of itself for what it required for him and for the community. So yeah, and he had to hold the secret from Cap and Mr. Marvin. You can imagine the three of them coming up together, right? They've known each other since they were knee-high. And so, you know, that's a big deal. You saw how Cap and Pop got into it in the diner, you know? So, you know, they're friends, they're colleagues, they're people who understand the gravity of the situation.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And would you mind if I just added a follow-up kind of question to that?
Sure.
So yeah, I think that makes total sense. And I'm like, everything that the older generations like lived through as well, I think really like builds on that and like I guess strengthens their point of view. And so that being said, do you think that after the speech that Alice gave, I think it was to, I'm blanking on his name, but the priest.
Pastor Brown.
Pastor Brown, yes, Pastor Brown. I think the book kind of alluded to after that there might have been some pause, like for thought on his end, because he seemed a little bit silent after that, like there wasn't really a rebuttal to what Alice said, like there was a sense of almost like a silent agreement. Do you think that after what Alice said, that was going to kind of shift some decision-making and like conclusions that people of the older generations might have had prior?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because think about how you all feel in your lives when you have opinions and the elders just say, that's just the way we did it, right? And how crushing that feels to your ingenuity, your curiosity, what you envision the world looking like for your future. And, I think to think about how the elders have historically used that sort of, that's just the way it is, and that's the way it's been, and that's the way it will be, that's something every generation experiences, right? So then the elders become the ones saying, they go from being told to be the tellers, right, over time. And so, I do think that there's a point, and my hope is that when y'all read that part, that you see that there's room for dialogue. Because now it's like, you go through the whole thing, okay, boomer, and you go through, well, Gen Z doesn't know this, and blah, 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 and you have all these sort of generational wars, but Gen Z got something to say. Gen X got something to say. Millennials got something to say. Everybody has something to say, but it's a question of whether we're able to dialogue. And I think at that point, again, to the point of, like, the young people are organizing. And so the question becomes, like, think about how he would feel from a pulpit, looking around, seeing all these young people he's baptized, all these young people who grew up in his church lying to him. And I don't know how y'all are, but my priest will read you, my pastor will read you from the pulpit. Now, he won't call you by name, but he will definitely read you from the pulpit. And so when he's talking about you. But think about the disappointment that he feels knowing that all these people, and then his friend, all these people kept that from him. So, I mean, there are conversations, I think, with him that will happen, that have to happen at the pop level. I think there are conversations that need to occur with the young people talking to their elders. And I think that was an opportunity for him to pause, like you said, and to say, this young woman who I invited into my home, who understands how special New Jessup is, she's maybe making a little sense here. Because it's not, I know it's popular to think that your elders can't change. They can't change their opinions. So I think one of the things that comes with age is the wisdom to know that evolution is inevitable. And it's sort of this intransigence. I love this word, I could never say it. That keeps us sort of stuck. But it's when y'all speak up and use your voice and speak your mind and say, hey, this is how it is, and this is what we see moving forward. This is what we want our future to look like. And I think that that's something that he took the time to pause and consider. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question.
All right. That was our last question.
All right.
Thank you for coming out.
All right, thank you.